In this segment, I'll talk about mating, pregnancy, and give an overview of the ways in which the brain, pituitary gland, uterus, and embryo communicate to support pregnancy. So here's the uterus again, and the uterine lining has gotten thicker and thicker. The ovum has moved out down the oviduct, and of course the estrogen surge has triggered mating behaviors in the brain. At this point, there will be sperm coming up and reaching the ovum. The ovum at this stage has vesicles just beneath the surface that are packed with GAGs, glycosaminoglycans, or related molecules that swell with water. When a sperm contacts and begins to penetrate the membrane, that opens calcium channels, and a wave of calcium spreads beneath the surface of the membrane of the ovum. Calcium binds to binding proteins that are associated with the vesicles, and the result is that all these GAGs are released. And of course, the GAGs and related molecules swell up with water. And that swelling causes other sperm to fail to bind or to get trapped. So the GAGs released upon penetration of the sperm block any second sperm from getting through. So we have a uterine lining with many cells stimulated to develop from the estrogen, and the LH surge causes cells on the surface to produce binding proteins for the embryo. And so as the embryo goes through early cell division, it eventually gets to a stage where it has binding proteins that match those in the cells of the uterine lining. And that process, attachment, then is followed by more cell division. So more cells invade the uterus in a mammal, and inside is a small group of cells that will become the embryo itself, and other cells will become the amnion, and down here the allantois and chorion. Remember, the amnion is going to surround and protect. The allantois and the chorion, oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange, and they'll pick up nutrients, and eventually a blood supply from the embryo will move out into these cells and bring nutrients back and get rid of wastes. There's one additional important piece here, which is that these cells of the extraembryonic membranes will secrete a hormone, chorionic gonadotropin, and we'll call that hormone CG. So this is a hormone indicates pregnancy. So what happened in the ovary to all the cells left behind in the follicle after ovulation? Those cells become what's called a corpus luteum, yellow body. The corpus luteum has cells that secrete progesterone. They switch from secreting estrogen to secreting progesterone because of the LH surge. So the LH surge stops the secretion of estrogen and increases the secretion of progesterone. That progesterone is necessary for the uterine lining. Without progesterone, the uterine lining is digested and removed. Let's go back to the hormone concentrations, again at the different stages. Time here, and here's the early and growing follicles to a mature follicle, to mating and fertilization, to an early embryo, and then to a developing embryo. GnRH was high initially, went down until around the time when the ovum was mature and had a surge, and then went back down. LH was high initially, went down, had a surge, and went back down in response to GnRH. FSH was also higher, had actually a smaller surge, and went back down. Estrogen was low initially, rose, and then had a surge and went down. Progesterone has been low, started to go up around the time of ovulation, and then went up to a higher level as pregnancy started. The progesterone has negative feedback on GnRH just like LH does, and so while that embryo is there, GnRH stays low. And so as a result, LH and FSH stay low. So no new follicles develop. As this embryo is growing, new follicles are not. Progesterone is maintaining the uterine lining. The reason that progesterone is maintaining the uterine lining is that the extraembryonic membranes, in other words, outside the embryo, the extraembryonic membranes are producing chorionic gonadotropin. Chorionic gonadotropin is acting on the cells of the corpus luteum to cause them to continue producing progesterone. Now let's think about all of these three parts together. The brain and pituitary with kisspeptin negative and kisspeptin positive cells, the ovary, and the uterus. These three parts interact and must communicate with each other in order to provide information to cause proper timing of each of the events. So at the beginning, the brain is indicating that it's okay to start reproduction, and GnRH is high. That triggers follicle growth and gametogenesis, the development of the ovum. Estrogen both inhibits GnRH, it acts on the Kiss negative cells so that there's less GnRH, and estrogen also makes the uterine lining begin to grow. With estrogen, there's less GnRH and LH and FSH, so only large follicles survive. They have more receptors. So even though there's less LH and FSH, they survive. Estrogen continues to inhibit the brain and make the uterine lining even thicker. When there's a mature follicle, mature ovum, there's a high amount of estrogen, and that stimulates the K-positive cells to increase GnRH. There's a GnRH surge and LH surge. That LH surge causes ovulation and even more estrogen, and the estrogen triggers mating behaviors. At that point, the ovary stops producing estrogen, produces progesterone, which maintains the uterine lining. And remember that at the time of the surge, there are binding proteins for the embryo, and so the embryo can attach and begin to grow. The growing embryo is supported by progesterone, which supports the lining, and it now produces chorionic gonadotropin. The chorionic gonadotropin causes the corpus luteum to continue producing progesterone, so that as long as the embryo is there and growing, it'll produce chorionic gonadotropin, which will continue to produce progesterone, and that feedback will allow the embryo to grow to maturity. And the progesterone in the brain causes preparation for birth. So as you think about this, the brain, pituitary, ovary, uterus, and embryo are communicating at every stage the critical events. As long as the embryo is present, it will produce chorionic gonadotropin that will bind to receptors on cells of the corpus luteum, which will cause progesterone production, and that will bind to receptors within cells of the uterine lining and cause them to be maintained. If the embryo is lost, if it's defective or dies, then chorionic gonadotropin stops. Chorionic gonadotropin stops binding. These cells stop producing progesterone. The brain stops receiving progesterone. Progesterone has been inhibiting GnRH, which has stopped new follicles from growing. But if this process stops, then progesterone will no longer make it to the brain. The inhibition will disappear. We'll have GnRH will increase once there's no longer inhibition from progesterone. The uterine lining will be lost or digested. The uterus will go back to the original state, and now we'll have the whole process starting again with high GnRH, small follicles being able to grow, small uterus, and a new cycle beginning.